What better way is there to rack up the controversy, the hateful comments, and as such the YouTube views and dollars, than by talking about that most vitriolic of issues in American politics, the Second Amendment? And of course its historical context, which is what I'm actually interested in, and what this video will be about. Now, while I say that, this video is actually not meant to be political in any way. Of course, the last time that I made a video regarding guns in really any light, where I talked about a commercial which had a rather inauthentic portrayal of how muskets worked, that video was wholly apolitical. I didn't mention my own political views. I didn't say anything at all about the issues that I was talking about. I didn't talk about the Second Amendment or anything like that. I just talked about, hey, the way that this commercial shows a musket being used isn't really that authentic. And I did add at the very end that perhaps if they had shown a portrayal of a musket that was more authentic, that showed more of a knowledge of how those bits of equipment worked, then perhaps the commercial may be more efficient at getting its message across, because people would be less inclined to nitpick at, oh, well, look, you got this little detail wrong, therefore the entire argument that you made, which has nothing to do with that detail, is irrelevant, which is something that both sides accomplish. I shouldn't say accomplish, it makes it sound like it's something to be proud of, which is something that both sides do. Oftentimes in the gun debates in particular, they will latch onto little details and use that as a way to attack the character or the intellect of the other side without ever actually addressing the point or the argument that the other side made. It's very common in all sorts of debates. Sadly, God, abortion is probably the worst one in the world. It's of course a very common way of repeating the idea there is, of course, that one side says, well, that they are pro-choice, and how dare the other side be against choice. Then the other side says that they are pro-life, and how dare the other side say they are against life. Both sides are completely missing the point of what the other team or the other side is actually arguing. They are simply arguing against what they think the other side is arguing, and that is not any way to carry out a political discussion. It is not a way to carry out debate or a polite discourse in a modern democracy. That is entirely besides the point of what this video is meant to be about, but let that be a little, hopefully lesson, a little bit of inspiration to people too. Please, at the very least, when you're having a discussion with someone, listen to what they are saying, not what you think they're saying, or not what their side says, as if they have a side and you want to assign them to a team, if you will. No, listen to what that individual is actually saying and address what that person is arguing, not what everyone else on their side happens to say. Yes, argue individuals, not invisible teams. Anyways, the Second Amendment. That video, it was not political. It wasn't political in any way, and yet a number of the comments, understandably so. You know, it's almost as if I sort of baited the comments into being very angry and hasty, and they're debating and arguing with one another for my own personal benefit, you know, given that I was talking about a fairly controversial topic. But, of course, I would never do that sort of thing again. No, this video is nothing like that at all. But many of the comments in that video were highly political in nature, and a lot of them regardless of the actual side that they are, or regardless of what they were arguing, a lot of the comments on both sides really did seem to draw back for their basis the historical origins of the Second Amendment, of the idea of a population, of a civilian populace overthrowing their government. And a lot of the comments were talking about how that sort of thing was necessary and how well, it was a good thing, so to say, in the past. This video, I'm not going to be talking about whether or not it is right or wrong for a civilian population to be able or to be capable of overthrowing what is seemingly their lawfully appointed government. I'm not going to talk about whether or not it is feasible for them to do so in the modern day. You know, that is an incredibly complicated topic, and it encapsulates, so many different aspects of society, whether or not the Second Amendment, either in its current form, like how, gun laws in the United States work, or in its purest form, like as if there was, no restrictions at all. In any case, no matter how it's applied, if you will, I'm not going to talk about whether or not it is enough to safeguard the tree of liberty and blood of tyrants and that sort of. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in talking about the modern day. I am only going to be talking in this video about the origins of the amendment, and whether or not, basically having an armed civilian population was, in the 1770s, sufficient to overthrow the government, the British, colonial state apparatus, if you will. Now, that, of course, being said, I look forward to reading all of your comments about how I'm making an argument in the modern times and how you all feel so very important in your own gun arguments, but, well, oh well. Let's go for it, shall we? Was the idea behind the Second Amendment, of course the Second Amendment wasn't around before the United States was founded, that would be silly to suggest, but the idea of the Second Amendment that, the civilian population has the right to maintain and bear arms, to maintain their militia forces in order to withstand against government tyranny, basically, was that enough? Was that sufficient for the United States to gain its independence? And indeed, in that situation, for these militia organizations to overthrow a foreign, supposedly tyrannical and occupying, in a way, force? And the answer to that question, that very specific, non-political concern, I'm afraid would be no. Indeed, the militia were nowhere near sufficient to actually win the American War of Independence. They certainly did assist, they certainly did help, and indeed, in the early days of the war, it was the militiamen who provided the possibility for the war to expand the way that it did, and for independence to be won, but the militia themselves, only the militia, as if they themselves were to carry on through the entirety of the war without all these other factors I'm going to talk about, would that have been sufficient to win the thing? No, it certainly would not have been. Now, of course, the first thing that most people talk about here would be the massive amount of international support which the fledgling United States received against the British Empire. The French, the Spanish, the Dutch, all these different people sent over massive numbers of either massive amounts of money or resources or even troops to aid the United States in becoming independent. And without this international support, I think it is a fair thing to say that even if the United States had won its independence, it would have taken a lot longer. It would not have been so clean or so simple a cut, if you will. The war would have been a lot longer and a lot more costly, really for all sides involved, I imagine. It's important to remember that the largest battle in the entirety of the war, the Siege of Gibraltar, took place in Europe, not in the continental United States. Indeed, the largest battle, the United States wasn't even really involved. It was just the Spanish trying to reclaim the fortifications at Gibraltar, which they've still never done, haha. But that was the largest land battle. The naval war, as well, was largely a European-centric one. Indeed, it was during the course of the war that it was actually thought in Britain, at least for some time, that it was very possible that the French would invade them. So great was the concern with the war against France over top of the war with the colonials. Sort of France, when they entered into the war, they were seen as the really big foe. They were the ones who very nearly invaded Britain, and that would have been, a great big to do, as it were, for the British, as you may imagine. So much so, of course, that at the Battle of Yorktown, which, by the way, at the Battle of Yorktown, the final battle, if you will, the French forces actually made up very nearly half of the total, rebel, if you will, rebel alliance, a rather funny way to put it, but yes, half the forces were Americans, half of them were French. So even would the siege have ended as it did without their assistance? Probably not, to say nothing of the fact that it was the French Navy that blockaded the British in Yorktown, again, one of the final nails in the coffin. A great deal, many of the soldiers fighting in the Americas were French, and that isn't the only place, in Europe, potentially invading England, in the Americas, supplying massive numbers of men to assist the rebel forces, wasn't the only places where the fighting was taking place. The French were also fighting the British in India during the war. And this is to say nothing, again, of the financial support and other massive amounts of support that came from people like the Dutch to the American rebels, and the Spanish fighting the British in the Caribbean and in Florida and all these different, more southerly locations. It was a global war, and by no means were the Americans the only ones to have that sort of instrumental role in winning their own independence. They relied on a massive international network. Now, that being said, however, it is still very possible and very easy, I think, to make the argument that eventually the United States would have won its independence, and it could have won it on its own. We sort of get into like alternate history territory there, which is always a very dangerous thing to do. But I think it's at least arguable that yes, the United States would have eventually won it on its own. And indeed, during the war as it was, the United States was, of course, the rebels that would become the United States, they were, of course, the most... Yeah, no, they certainly were the most instrumental aspect of the conflict, seeing that the entire thing was still based around them, even if there were larger conflicts and possibly of greater consequence, if you will, taking place elsewhere. It was still the Americas which were the catalyst, if you will, for the entirety of the conflict abroad. If it ended there, it would have ended elsewhere as well, and this is what we saw happen in the actual war. So it is very possible to take this sort of argument and this sort of discussion outside of the international context and only talk about the North American context. And if we, again, sort of ignore that at the Battle of Yorktown, for example, half of the soldiers were French, and it probably wouldn't have ended the same way, we can still talk about whether or not the American militiamen would have been enough to eventually win the conflict. But even still, I think this is absolutely not the case. This is largely because we have the presence of, and most of the important actions were taken by, the Continental Army. We may be saying, well, now those are still American forces, and they are still American supplied with firearms and the like. But I think the most important distinction to make here is that they are not militiamen. They are by their standards, they were a modern military force. They were kept under military discipline and trained to military standards and outfitted indeed with military-grade equipment to win the nation's independence. Even disregarding the French assistance, the Continentals were an army in their own right. And so the American militiamen, as it were not, simply put, the only ones to win the independence of their nation. And I don't think either that if we were to remove the international assistance as well as the Continental Army's assistance during the war, and we were to only leave the militiamen, the Francis Marions and the Mel Gibsons of the world to fight off the tyrannical British Empire, would the war have ended anywhere near the same way? No, absolutely not. The rebellion in that case would have been crushed. It would have been swept aside, I think, rather simply because the militia did not have the staying power to actually fight that sort of war of that scale, of that longevity, of that intensity that the Continental Army and their international allies were capable and able to actually fight. And if you don't believe me, if you don't take my word for it when I'm saying this, perhaps you might take the word of an actual Continental soldier.